All right, you're now listening to a sneak preview segment of our very first episode, Behind the Curtain. This is our Oscar Talk edition. Enjoy. Now it's time for our roundtable discussion. Each episode of BTC, our collective host brainpower will try to miraculously save the film industry, one opinion at a time. This week we are mandated by film critic law to talk about the Oscars, a ceremony that legendary actor George C. Scott described as, quote, a 2-hour meat parade, a public display with contrived suspense for economic reasons. Since Scott's death in 1999, we should update that comment to a 3-hour meat parade. And with a long time, ratings declined to boot.
Yeah.
So, Chris, Nate, you guys watched the ceremony in its entirety. What were your impressions?
Overall, I mean, I was more entertained by the show than I expected to be. Jimmy Kimmel, who I'm not the biggest fan of, but I thought he actually did surprisingly well and just kept the show going and had a good introduction and good jokes kind of throughout the way. And I thought the continual roasting of Matt Damon throughout was pretty entertaining too. And man, how can you beat that ending? That was I was happy to have witnessed history in the making, watching that historic flub. So, Nate, what did you think?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely very entertaining this year, as it always is every year. But it's usually like kind of a glitz and glamour fest. You see all these people put on these like faces of how they want to appear in public to receive or see these awards. And this time it felt like how you would receive, this is such a wild connection to make, but how you would receive Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, where it's the majority of the album is the imaginary world, and then the last song, A Day in the Life, is suddenly the kick to reality, where like the reveal of the actual Best Picture winner became this humbling and like realistic thought. And it was very entertaining. I love Kimmel's banter with Damon. That definitely kept the show going. Chris Rock last year did a good job, and then he did a kind of an okay job in some parts, so he was inconsistent. Kimmel was consistent. I gotta give him credit for that. And that's something the Oscars loves, is consistency. Yeah. So I enjoyed it a lot, and I think it was a good thing for the Oscars themselves.
I like that comparison to Sgt. Pepper's, the solemn piano drone, which is exactly how we're supposed to receive Moonlight. And do you guys think that Moonlight's reputation is enhanced from getting the Best Picture win? There was a running joke throughout the ceremony about how little people had seen the film.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I personally saw the film. I liked it for the most part. Not sure whether it was Best Picture worthy or not. I guess any film that's going to kind of rise up the ranks and be the underdog that kind of takes the big award home. Yeah, I mean, something people are going to start paying attention to it and kind of giving it another look-see and finding out, maybe I should actually check out this film. The content itself is going to, I think, divide Americans, conservatives and liberals, so it definitely is a film to talk about. So,
assuming conservatives see it.
Yeah, I really liked Moonlight when I watched it. It didn't give me the like satisfactory feeling that La La Land gives. There's this like feeling of euphoria that a lot of films capture, that you just feel like an uplifting in the movie. You just feel like a sense of just getting out of your chair and moving with the movie. And Moonlight didn't do that. It was very calming, and I liked it for that calmness. For a lot of the times, it was all over the place with emotion, not in the bad way, more in the constructive way. But La La Land, why it didn't seem like a Best Picture winner to me in comparison to Moonlight was because it's inconsistent in pacing. The part that dragged me down was, of course, the stereotypical love story falling out of the two lovers, and then the reassembling of them near the end of the story. And of course, spoiler alert, had that bittersweet ending. Mm-hmm. But Moonlight was utilitarian, and Bryn and I have talked about this before, about how it uses like kind of the bare minimum of information to be able to convey something. And the best example of that would be Mahershala Ali's character being noted, spoiler alert, as killed in the second of the 3 parts of the film. And all they did was say it in like an offhanded comment, and that's all you ever get about like completion of that character. So it was good for pacing because it was realistic in that utilitarian way. The story itself is about belonging, and he only, of course, feels that in the Moonlight. And I liked how they use that. It's something you kind of have to figure out. It's a puzzle that you have to interrogate and then realize. And the more I think about the movie afterwards, the more I like it. And that, to me, is a big quality of a Best Picture movie is the more you pull out of it in afterthought, the more meaning it has to you.
You were explaining the symbolism you took away from the film, that impressionistic aspect that you think is, through more interpretations, through more viewings, you're getting a better grasp of what the movie's about. Do you think that's going to hold true for all viewers?
I mean, the movie means to you what it means to you, and that's going to be consistent through any film at any time. The thing the director, I think, was going for was the sense of belonging. I've heard other people talk about that, and it is kind of a niche story as far as like what the normal hegemonic norm of the media and our society, as shown as like white male, straight sort of norm. This is a black male, closeted homosexual, or semi-closeted anyway, and he. What it is it's a story about belonging, and they try to unite people's mindsets on that sense of belonging, whereas they might be alienated by that sense of something that's totally out of what people perceive as the hegemonic norm. So that, I think, it is a progressive filmmaking aspect, and that it's helping a lot more people relate to these things that people probably would have just brushed off before. It definitely did a good job of having a universal theme that everybody could relate to if they found a way to relate to it.
Yeah, the words that came to mind from a established film critic, Richard Brody of The New Yorker, he called the film painfully intimate. And it seems to me that for a lot of people, what you mentioned earlier, that degree of empathy, whether they relate to the film through bullying that happens to the main character,
right,
or through struggles with their mothers, through struggles in family communication. There's a lot of different networks that happen, and the astonishing thing about it, I don't want to bore people with the technical details, but we're obligated to say the film was shot for $1.5 million over 21 days, a 21-day shooting schedule. So I've got a lot of, at this point, asinine observations about the film, but you have to acknowledge that for what they did in 21 days with a budget that was $500,000 less than a 30-second ad on the Super Bowl, it's pretty remarkable, especially the fact that won Best Picture. That's kind of a narrative that might make this Oscar ceremony stand a little bit longer than many forgettable ones in the recent past.
Definitely a historical marker as far as Oscar ceremonies. It's definitely a big change as far as things we've seen in the past. The Oscars so white trend of last year, where American Sniper was questioned for even being up on the podium. I like that it is so cheaply, quote unquote, made. In that it is utilitarian, again, just like how the movie is. It's a synecdoche, it's like a part representing a whole. So it attests to the movie in a way. And I really like that because it's not like they made it deliberately with that choice, but it's a nice little it's a fun factoid to hear about that kind of thing. Like, it's descriptive of the movie itself. And you were saying another time that if they had more time, more budget, that they could have delved deeper into certain aspects. I'd like to hear more about that again if you don't.
Yeah, I mean, I have some kind of open questions for Barry Jenkins because I didn't think he was deserving of the Best Director award, which he was nominated for and did subsequently lose. But the main reason being, and being as, I think, optimistic and hopeful as possible, is that I think he's capable of making better movies with a longer shooting schedule and a bigger budget. I'd like to hope he agrees with me.
Have either of you seen, by the way, any of his other films?
What are his other films? They're all, you know what? I did see a little one he made at the University of Florida that was made right after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, about two Muslim laundromat owners who are trying to show that they are deep down of the American and therefore of the human spirit to be able to feel empathy. And how they do that is they put a sign out I skimmed through it because I was reading an article about him at the same time. They had, at the end of the movie, they put up a sign on their laundromat that says American flags washed free. And that says more than those words themselves.
I mean, the dude's got a Vimeo account.
He does, yeah. He does.
The guy that just won Best Picture has had a Vimeo account for 9 years.
What a time to be alive.
Yeah, it's a changing of the guard.
And I kind of heard he was, and correct me if I'm wrong, but he was pulled out of somewhat semi-self-imposed retirement to make Moonlight. He had made some projects previously and was not really feeling about doing, Moonlight or really any projects initially, but then he just kind of got involved. And I mean, even that aspect, regardless of the shooting schedule or the limitations on that, the limitations on the budget, just the fact that he didn't even want to work on this or helm this project to begin with? I mean, that's pretty.
I know he was a curator for the Telluride Film Festival, and that was, I think, through those connections how he met up with the producers. And as we know, producers are the ones that, make the ideas come to fruition. So, I'm not exactly sure myself what his origins were, but the guy's 37, so I think making any sweeping generalizations about where he had decided his career was going to go, he probably had no idea that the climate was going to be this responsive. Did anybody?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was the only indication, I think, because there's this running narrative, which to a certain extent is kind of a knock on Moonlight, that the film was a response for the times, right? Moonlight won because Hillary lost. It's kind of a caustic assumption.
Very much feels that way.
Prior to that, the film that was getting all of the hype at Sundance was The Birth of a Nation. And that was already being considered an Oscar frontrunner before every single thing that could have went wrong went wrong. The allegations about Nate Parker that definitely had enough substance to them to basically tear apart the film, and the fact that Parker was so centrally involved in the making of the movie more or less undermined that one. And then when critics themselves saw it, they did not regard it as, that's the thing, Moonlight actually has the critical substance. It's, not exactly just the zeitgeist. It's a film that Emma Stone as actress, but other critics too have declared a masterpiece.
Yeah, and man, did they choose the right time to make that kind of film. As another side note to that, though, that's the fifth film that Plan B Productions, Brad Pitt's Productions, has won Best Picture for. Another one being 12 Years a Slave, and the other three escape me at the current moment.
Yeah.
But he's on a roll, too.
Oh, yeah. And going back to Nate's original question, and sorry I cut you off earlier, but just some things that you would have liked to have seen more fleshed out in the script or in the story for Moonlight?
Yeah, people were really forgiving, I think, of the film's flaws, which I think are understandable because every movie has a degree of limitations it's going to work through that you just have to accept as the viewer, right? You start out, let's assume you watch all movies with kind of a critical eye, which is what we're assuming our listeners are going to do. You have this assumption of, well, okay, the film is going to work this way. So I was coming into the film and heard a lot about how visually gorgeous the movie was. It had these Terrence Malick's flourishes to it that just, and so I was expecting this film to be really visually engaging, and the cinematography was really highly applauded. But when I watched it, I was seeing a series of close-ups, a lot of head and shoulder dominant frames. So when those moments happen, and they're there, those Malick flourishes, and you have this booming classical music, which I regarded as pretentious, but people thought this was a really fundamental element to the movie. It didn't really do a lot for me. I think there's a lot of positive aspects of it. The three actors that are playing the same character, they don't resemble each other, but you felt it. You felt that they were all the same character. But yeah, the tonal differences, and I have nothing nice at all to say about the script. I thought it was incredibly ordinary, pedestrian. The actors are so phenomenal that you just overlook the script. I can't think of one even average performance.
It was adapted from a book that had a longer title that had Moonlight in it as well.
A play, yeah.
Yeah, a play.
Do you think this is an example of a film, being more critically applauded, not so much for its content or even for its form, but just for issues surrounding it?
Its message.
Just the representation of a type of character or type of human being on screen that's normally not seen in mainstream media. Is that seen just mainly as the main triumph?
It's a fair question because there was this continual mantra from a lot of established critics that said, this is the type of film that needs to be made. So Moonlight is in many respects the prototype. History is going to be, the answer to what impact this film has. I'm a little skeptical. This is all just kind of grumpy prognostication, but the Oscars is kind of like a friend of yours. We'll call him Oscar, who has a crush on somebody, and then they have a crush on another person, and then you're kind of talking about them. Oh, remember when you had that crush on that person? With Oscar, they had this crush on Crash. They had this crush on...
The Crash crush.
Yeah, they had this crush on 12 Years a Slave.
Oh, yeah.
There are these moments that the Oscars has had, the moment of clarity where they realize that, we need to have moments of racial harmony and balance. And as great as that has been, and the message is apparently deliberate on this, I'm a little skeptical. I really don't know to what extent Moonlight has the historical impact outside of what happened at the ceremony. And it's also because I think Jenkins actually is going to make a better film.
Being both, students of film yourselves, looking over the history of Oscars in general, and seeing films that, like you said, win these awards that are kind of caught up in the moment, what's popular or hot at the day, or not just films, but actors or performers. And then as time goes on, those actors or performers are forgotten, the films themselves are forgotten. So what value do the Oscars have, essentially, if what they're voting on and what they're applauding is something that will be kind of forgotten in a few months or a few years?
Yeah, there's two different audiences in this. You have your niche audience, which again I'm going to presume is everybody listening to this, your budding cinephiles, and you follow the Oscars really loyally on in your early love of movies, and then you watch them out of obligation. But what happens in that transition is something happens where a movie you despise wins Best Picture, and it went up against some movie you dearly loved. For me personally, watching the Best Picture go to Argo, and also Birdman was a pretty rough blow because Boyhood took 12 years to make. We're never going to see a film like that again. But even if Boyhood hadn't won, I thought the most prestigious potential that Wes Anderson ever had to win Best Picture was for Grand Budapest Hotel.
I'm curious what he's going to produce next too, as well, because if he just gets better and better every film I see, then
He's
it
doing
does
a
kind of
stop
go
motion
off and
film
on.
on dogs.
That's
And
right.
That's my point. Is that
That's
Wes made us the one movie of his that, for all we know, will ever get the closest to sniffing it, and instead it was given to this really awkward vanity project that was done in a short period of time and was considered to be done in one take, which was kind of a deception in itself. I mean, I don't know. Birdman
It's very
was
representative of Hollywood itself.
exactly right.
So you had said earlier, Birdman was made kind of in between making The Revenant.
Yeah,
right.
that's right. And
Because
the
The
other
Revenant
movie.
had those really long production shooting schedules, and the hell of pulling all that off was just a reality they had to deal with in advance.
And Birdman and Revenant were directed by the same man.
Alejandro Giannarutu.
Inarritu.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's what I'm saying, is that the budding cinephiles are very, very invested in the outcome of Best Picture, and then they get burned. And I mean, I shared my story, but every person's got their own. It's just something that they'll never, ever forgive the Oscars for, ever. So, and then you have the general audience, which is also another concern too. Historically, the ratings are declining. There's this continual criticism about the fact that I think some statistic came out that 40% of the public in this general survey could only name one Best Picture nominee this year. I mean, that's a little astonishing too, because Hidden Figures was the #1 movie at the box office. I mean, it blew away all expectations. Maybe that was the one movie people were able to name. You would have assumed that someone on the street would have at least known Hidden Figures and La La Land.
Or Arrival, even. Like
Yeah.
that's one of the bigger sci-fi movies of the last year.
Yeah.
And this is a point I'll probably mention in future episodes, though, but it becomes this thing where how niche of a crowd are we as cinephiles? Are we really, are we up there with Star Trek Next Generation? But I mean, every year does the crowd constrict? And we'll explore that in future podcasts too. So it's an interesting dilemma that the Oscars is facing, is the overall relevance of film.
Just as a comparison, and this is probably just being unnecessarily snarky, but like Star Trekkies, as far as like nerd factor compared to cinephiles, that is just one medium there, or one media form that, or I guess 5 if you're counting the shows and the movies and stuff, that they're analyzing, and they always have these set restrictions of like, you got to be in this futuristic world, it's got to be like philosophical some way, and film itself is this like open medium that's so many different kinds of people. Like there's the Tarantino lovers, there's the people who love the like Jane Austen adaptations of movies, which are on the total other side of the spectrum. So there's all sorts of camps of who could love these films for what the mediums do for this. And it's hard to call yourself a cinephile because you could divide that into so many different categories. I know I love sci-fi movies, but there's all sorts of different kinds of sci-fi movies to take into consideration, like sci-fi horror, and then there's sci-fi philosophical, and so on and so forth. I mean, there's just too many to be able to delineate. And it's hard to see what the future could be because who knows what the future of genres could hold. Westerns used to be super popular. Now it's crime since like the 1990s and Law and Order and Cops came out and stuff.
Superhero films.
Yeah, superhero films are new and ever since 2012, the Avengers got so popular and the movies premeditating that. Who knows how superhero films are going to go now, or if they're just going to be a flash in the pan and then dissolve as soon as Black Panther comes around or something.
There was kind of a moment, a catalyst of The Dark Knight, which is going to always be considered by far one of the most critically acclaimed Best Pictures. And the Best Picture nominations at that time, I believe, are still constricted to 5. Regardless of whether they were still constricted to just 5 nominations or had expanded the field, The Dark Knight did not get nominated.
It was that until 2010. Sorry to be
until 2010.
Yeah.
Okay, so it was before then. But I think The Dark Knight kind of spurred on this, now it's considered populist approach, where the Best Picture field expanded. A lot of people interpret it as the fact that the Oscars was trying to seek a larger audience. And I'd have to say, 6-7 years into the experiment, it doesn't seem to be working.
Yeah, it did a couple things. It called back to the old Oscars, where they did have upwards of 10 nominees. And it did try to expand audiences. And it was almost a direct reaction to The Dark Knight, because I think it was the year after that they did that. Because I know Dark Knight came out 2007, 2008, and then the year that Avatar came out was the year that they did the 10 of them. It was Avatar and like District 9, and I was surprised because there was 2 notable sci-fi movies that were nominated for Best Picture.
Which is kind of what makes, for instance, The Return of the King such an anomaly too.
Yeah,
because,
that is
it's not sci-fi,
such
but
good-
it is fantasy, and the fact that I think all 3 of those films were at least nominated for Best Picture all 3 years in a row, and then the third film, final film, ended up winning. So I guess why that trend didn't continue now, like you said, now that with Dark Knight being somewhat of a game changer and superhero films or comic book films being taken in more esteem. Not to say that fantasy and comic book films are the same thing, but they're definitely, it's fantastical worlds and that sort of thing. But yeah, why we're not seeing more of those types of films.
That takes me to one thing that I really, really wish that the industry would consider more of an audience for is dark fantasy and serious sci-fi and serious fantasy, because we get all these like playful teen
Twilight?
Yeah, that and
Twilight-y?
and like superhero movies that appeal to that same age basis for the male and female demographics, respective of the superheroes. But we need more like The Dark Knight, where it is kind of The Dark Knight being sort of a criticism and acknowledgement of terrorism and counterterrorism, and The Lord of the Rings being, as far as my Lord of the Rings friends say, a giant metaphor for the nuclear war. Right?
We're going to have to push that back to another podcast.
That's another podcast.
Stay tuned for our Lord of the Rings as the nuclear.
These ones that are like metaphors, or ones that have deeper meanings, or ones that can be like double read, and put it in a format that everybody loves and give it a bit of like a serious bite to it, so that it has gravity and so that people actually feel something from it, instead of like, oh, Iron Man almost died for the 3rd movie in a row but survived again. Didn't see that coming. Yeah. So I mean, I want more of that, where like maybe the superhero does die and then their best friend takes up their helm and keeps going. That's the kind of thing that you want the weight from, and the weight is what makes the impact. The impact was what makes the memory.
And like you said before, Brennan, earlier, that trend doesn't seem to be happening anytime soon.
Unfortunately.
We're going to continue, I predict, just seeing for a while, these next couple of years, just more of the Moonlights, more of the La La Lands, the lower budget, independent films almost, the ones that are getting critically acclaimed, the smaller films, if you will, getting that recognition. And voters certainly spoke this year with giving it to Moonlight and almost La La Land, but not.
So
and
close.
that was still a surreal moment, watching that kind of play out in real time, those final minutes of this year's Oscars. And I think you had kind of I don't know if you want to call it a conspiracy theory,
yeah.
but how things went down. What's your interpretation?
This can
I
kind
promise
of
you it doesn't involve the nuclear war.
that we'll get there. So this kind of, I guess this can kind of tie up our podcast. We for today for this one, we can put like a nice little bow on after my little conspiracy spiel. But Hollywood loves stories about itself. Let's get that out of the way.
Yeah.
It loves the artist. It loves Birdman. It loves movies that talk about Hollywood, talk about the rising story, how nothing matters, and at the same time everything matters. So the story of how La La Land and Moonlight fought is the David and Goliath story that Hollywood wanted so bad and needed so bad. And so Moonlight is this underdog representative of like the new wanting to be hegemonic norm, which is fighting in even our current political state, which is a whole bigger issue. We'll get to the nuclear race later. Okay. So La La Land is that story, the artist and the Birdman story of Hollywood loving itself. And then the bittersweet ending, which is what I've heard a criticism of Hollywood loving itself. Like, you have all this sweetness, but then it doesn't always end the way you want it to end. But that's okay. If it won, that would have been okay. But it's good that it didn't, because then this conspiracy theory comes to fruition. These two have been fighting for, it seems like, months. Moonlight comes out before La La Land, and it racks up, a 99 out of 100 on Metacritic, which is almost unheard of. The Social Network got a 95, which is the only other highest one I've seen outside of like Zero Dark 30. So getting out of the statistical point, La La Land comes out and it's super popular. People are talking about it and people are like, oh, it's going to win Best Picture. And then it turns into, it's going to win Best Picture. So people are like, oh, please don't let La La Land win. And I've even seen a tweet, because those are the best informational source, of somebody saying, if La La Land wins Best Picture, I'm moving to Canada. And it's getting upwards of like the same things people would say with our politics. So ceremony comes around. Everyone's like, okay, well, this is the 3-hour La La Land's going to win kind of ceremony. All the things happen. A lot of like retribution happens in the way that like Mahershala Ali, and I pronounced his name wrong 3 times already now.
Mahershala.
Mahershala? That's it. Mahershala Ali.
Just because I heard it 50 times.
Yeah.
Jimmy Kimmel trying to repeat it
the way
the Oscars.
Yeah. Drilling it into our heads.
Yeah.
Mahershala wins. Best Supporting Actress goes to, I can't remember her name. Viola Davis. And so on and so forth. All these other people get what they deserve, quote unquote. So Best Picture comes around, and of anybody that could present it, it's Bonnie and Clyde. Bonnie and Clyde, who gets shot down in the car by just, I guess, the police, which could be the metaphor for the critics or for the people watching or anything. But they get shot down in front of this audience by mistaking Best Picture winner. It's Hollywood like kind of giving this little like nod, like, oh yeah, we tied a movie into this story as well. Like somebody, my conspiracy is that just by switching the cards, if one person did that, which probably more than likely, most definitely nobody did that deliberately. Just by switching the cards, they made this whole Hollywood story of David defeating Goliath, of Bonnie and Clyde taking another fall, and of Goliath winning seemingly and then suddenly getting taken down by David and retribution happening. And then Hollywood gets its story again. It gets its Star Wars story. It's guy coming from nowhere, coming up and defeating the big evil Titan. Mm-hmm. So that's the conspiracy theory.
And if I could add an afterword to your conspiracy theory, for all of the La La Land fans out there that were just devastated about the outcome, and I've seen you, the raving musical mobs out in the streets, I think you have to accept the fact that it was so beautiful how art was recreated in the reality of the ceremony. To have Mia and Sebastian's relationship end on these compromised terms, and to not to be too spoilery, but the fact that we actually got to see on stage what it looked like if La La Land had won Best Picture, and then to see it taken away, is exactly how the film ended. And I can't think of a more cooler outcome ever. To me, that's actually even a bigger untalked about narrative than Moonlight's success or, shocking victory, was the fact that the art was replicated within the reality of the film. So take solace in that, especially if, for me, the reasons I embraced La La Land and thought it was a better film than Moonlight was everybody considered that this escapist fantasy film, but I actually thought it was really grounded on decisions people make in real life about, needing to abandon a relationship to focus on your career. Happens to the best of us and the worst of us, and I thought it was a really powerful point to make in a film that had these elaborate fantasy constructs.
Going back to your theory, Nate, about Bonnie and Clyde, I have this book at home written by Mark Harris, and it's called Pictures at a Revolution, and it's actually on the cover is a still of Faye Dunaway and Warren Beatty from Bonnie and Clyde, and the whole concept of the book is actually the 1967 Oscars, 50 years ago. That's why they had them on the stage in the first place. The author really is kind of going into how that year, at least in Hollywood, was kind of a game changer year. How you've got kind of the older, established Hollywood movies vying for Best Picture, like Dr. Dolittle was up that year, with these more kind of like reckless, youthful, revolutionary films, basically, like In the Heat of the Night, The Graduate, and Bonnie and Clyde. So, you know, again, like what you're saying before, Brendan, about kind of art imitating life, life imitating art. This year, 50 years later, 2017, we could kind of see that same struggle, I guess, in a way kind of going on between La La Land, which is the homage to the traditional movie musicals, and then this more, if you want to call it, kind of a edgy film centering on a subject that is considered by some like maybe a taboo subject. So, and then the taboo piece, in a way, kind of winning out or triumphing over the established order. So yeah, I mean, it's something that I think people are going to be kind of contemplating for a while, if they choose to, if they care to, about what, you know, putting meaning behind this transfer from La La Land to Moonlight. So very interesting. Definitely got us talking today. So that was good.
This was a good roundtable discussion, and keep listening to us, everybody.